I've been studying wild bees, particularly bumblebees, for about nearly 30 years now, particularly trying to understand why they're declining and what we can do about it, and what in particular the impacts of pesticides are on wild bees. Wild bees are enormously important. There are more than 20,000 species of bee in the world, and they're all pollinators. The main pollinators of a great many wildflowers, and many of our crops. 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world need pollinating by some kind of insect, and it's usually some kind of a bee. So it's really vitally important that we look after these little creatures. Pollination of crops is more reliable and more resilient over time if it's being delivered by a lot of different species. If you just rely on one or two species and anything goes wrong, if a disease or some other event happens and wipes them out, then your crop fails. Whereas if you have lots of different species, then if one goes, something else can step into the gap. But the other reason is, I would argue, is a more, well, maybe a more sort of philosophical one, is that don't these creatures have as much right to survive as we do? A lot of our wild bees have declined very significantly over the last at least 50 years and probably longer than that, particularly due to habitat loss and exposure to pesticides. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, we've lost 3 species of bumblebee completely. There are a lot of bee species, even in Europe, for which we have pretty poor information. So we don't really have reliable data on their population trends, but those that we do have data for are overwhelmingly in decline. Bee declines, and in fact, wildlife declines in Europe generally have been much more dramatic in the areas that have gone further down the route towards very intensive agriculture with all the associated pesticide use and large fields and mechanization and so on. Actually, Eastern Europe still has some areas which are absolutely wonderful for flowers and bees and wildlife generally, because the agriculture is still more or less as it was 100 years ago. And obviously we can't kind of turn back the clock, we can't live in the past, but we do need to find a way to grow food which works with biodiversity and supports pollinators rather than wiping them out. Habitat loss has impacted on them. Climate change is beginning to impact on them. But pesticide exposure is undoubtedly one of the biggest drivers. In Europe, there are about 500 different pesticides licensed for use by farmers. These are toxins. Many of them are insecticides designed to kill insects. But many of the others, the fungicides and the herbicides, we're now beginning to realize are harmful to bees and other insects. And there are really complicated interactions between these pesticides that can make some of them more toxic when they're combined than they are in isolation. So, you know, the sad and really depressing kind of reality is that almost every bee in Europe is being constantly exposed to a whole cocktail of poison. There's really no evidence that crop yields declined when neonicotinoids were banned, both on, if you look at the European yields of oilseed rape, for example, following the 2013 ban, overall has been more or less stable. So there's really no evidence that farmers actually need these chemicals. But more broadly, it's simply crazy to be using chemicals which we know are really harmful to the environment. They're poisoning bees. They're also contaminating the soil, leaching into fresh waters, doing untold environmental damage, just so that we can maintain high yields of these kind of industrial crops, most of which go to produce food that's either unhealthy for people or they go for animal food. The whole system is absolutely absurd, and we need to move away from this heavy reliance on pesticides generally. We absolutely have to look after these lovely creatures. They've been around and pollinating crops and more broadly pollinating plants for well over 100 million years. And now they're in trouble, and it's entirely due to us, and they deserve better. We need to look after them.